The night clung to the air like a damp sheet, wrapping the streets of Ashford in a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. James Walker moved carefully along the cracked sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the small cardboard box in his hands. It had arrived that morning with no return address, only his name written in a jagged, hurried scrawl. Something about it felt wrong from the start, but curiosity, that dangerous cousin of trouble, had kept him from tossing it in the trash. The box was light, almost suspiciously so. Inside was a single object, wrapped in old newspaper that smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, almost metallic. When he peeled away the yellowed paper, the thing stared back at him with a grin too wide for comfort. A doll, about 10 inches tall, with wild, matted hair and eyes like polished obsidian marbles. The kind of eyes that seemed to follow you, unblinking, no matter where you moved. It was a Labubu doll, though James had never seen one in person before. He knew they were supposed to be cute collectibles, but there was nothing cute about this one. Its stitched smile looked wrong, uneven, as though done in haste by a hand that didn't care about symmetry. And the skin, if you could call it that, was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over its tiny frame. James placed it on his kitchen counter and stepped back. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, the same way it did whenever something didn't feel right. Not every gift is given in kindness. Some things carry more than they appear to. He told himself it was just a doll, but the truth was, James had learned long ago to listen to his instincts. Growing up black in Ashford had taught him that danger often wore a friendly face. From the white neighbor who smiled while calling the police on his friends for loitering, to the school principal who insisted the gifted program wasn't a good fit for him, the lesson was clear. Trouble rarely announced itself. Still, that night he left the doll where it was. He tried to focus on dinner, on the bills stacked neatly by the toaster, on the hum of the refrigerator. But each time he walked past the kitchen, he could swear the doll's head was tilted just a little differently. By midnight, James gave up on sleep. He sat in the living room with the TV on low, more for company than distraction. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping like tiny fingers drumming on wood. He froze, the sound threading its way into the room from the kitchen. The tapping stopped, replaced by the soft scrape of something moving across the counter. He told himself not to look. He almost succeeded. But when he finally turned his head toward the doorway, the doll was standing on the floor, halfway into the hall. James's heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't the kind of man who's scared easy, but fear has a way of bypassing logic. He picked it up, holding it at arm's length, and shoved it back into the box. This time he left it in the garage. Out of sight, out of mind, or so he hoped. The next morning the box was back on the kitchen counter. James called his sister Tasha. She listened without laughing, though he could hear the disbelief in her voice. "You sure you ain't just tired, Jay? You been working doubles all week." "I'm telling you, Tash. Moved. I put it in the garage. I locked the door." "Then maybe you need to burn it," she said, half joking. "Or better yet, drop it in the river." Burning it didn't work. Neither did the river. The doll came back each time, dry, intact, and always waiting for him in the same spot on the counter. And with each return the atmosphere in the house shifted. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners longer than they should. The creak of the floorboards became sharper, more deliberate, as though something unseen was pacing. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, just on the edge of hearing, like someone murmuring in the next room. James could never make out the words, but he could feel the intent. Not friendly, not curious. Watching. Measuring. By the fourth day, he stopped sleeping altogether. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the doll, determined to see it move. He thought about the history of the house, about his grandmother's stories of things that traveled across generations, carrying the pain and rage of those who had suffered before. She used to say some objects were anchors, holding not just memories but the spirits of those who had been wronged. That night, James saw it. The doll shifted, slow and deliberate, turning its head toward him until the black beads of its eyes locked with his own. And then, in a voice as clear as a whisper in his ear, it said his name. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The sound of his breathing filled the room, fast and shallow. The doll didn't move again, but its grin seemed wider. In the days that followed, James began to understand that the doll wasn't just haunting him, it was binding itself to him. He found old photographs on his kitchen table that hadn't been there before. Black and white images of black men and women he didn't recognize, standing in front of plantation houses, their eyes tired but unbroken. On the back of each photo, written in the same jagged scrawl as the box, was a date and a name. Many of the names matched those on the faded headstones in the overgrown cemetery just outside town. The realization hit hard. The doll was a vessel. And whatever lived inside it carried the weight of lives cut short, dignity stolen, and justice denied. It had been sent to him for a reason, though whether that reason was to destroy him or to use him, he couldn't yet tell. But one thing was certain, it wasn't leaving. By the seventh night, James no longer questioned whether the doll was real. The question was what it wanted from him. The photos kept coming, and with them, a heaviness in the air that felt like the moments before a thunderstorm. Every shadow seemed sharper, every silence heavier. The whispers were louder now, threading into his thoughts until he couldn't tell where his own mind ended, and their voices began. That he took the photographs to his grandmother's church the next morning, laying them out on a long wooden pew under the dim glow of stained glass light. Pastor Ruth, an elder with eyes that seemed to see through lies and time alike, looked over them with a stillness that made James uneasy. "These are not strangers, child," she said at last, her voice low. "They're kin. Maybe not by blood, but by history. Every one of them was taken before their time in this town or the next. Some by rope, some by badge, some by the quiet ways that kill the spirit first." James swallowed hard. "Why are they showing themselves to me?" "Because you can hear them," she said simply. "And because maybe they're done waiting for someone else to speak their names." She reached into her satchel and pulled out an old ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside were handwritten accounts from black families in Ashford going back more than a century. She flipped to a page and slid it toward him. There, in faded ink, was a sketch of the same wide-eyed doll. "It's been here before," Pastor Ruth said. "Every few generations it finds someone. Sometimes it drives them to madness. Sometimes it helps them set things right. But it always carries the same burden, the rage of those who were wronged and never saw justice." James looked down at the doll's unblinking face sitting on the pew beside him. Its grin seemed to dare him to ask the next question. "What do I do?" Pastor Ruth's answer was quiet but certain. "You choose. You run from it or you stand with it. But if you stand with it, be ready, because the truth it carries will tear this town open." That night, James made his choice. The doll became his shadow, following him from room to room, its presence pressing at the edges of his thoughts. He began to dream vividly, standing in cotton fields under a punishing sun, feeling the sting of a whip across his back, being dragged from a small-town jail cell in the dead of night, kneeling in the dirt as boots pressed down on his neck. Each time, he woke with the taste of blood and dirt in his mouth, the doll sitting at the foot of his bed. The dreams left behind more than fear, they left knowledge. Names, dates, places where bones lay buried in unmarked ground. James started digging, literally and figuratively. He went through county records, old newspaper archives, anything that might connect the dreams to reality. The deeper he went, the more the patterns emerged. Disappearances that had never been investigated, deaths ruled accidental despite evidence to the contrary, all centered on black residents of Ashford. And at the edges of many of those are. A brick smashed through his front window carrying a note. "Stop digging or we'll bury you with them," but the doll never left his side. And the whispers, once indistinct, began to form words. They told him where to look, what to find, which doors to knock on. Elderly neighbors who had been silent for decades began to talk, their voices trembling as they recounted what they'd seen in their youth. Some cried when they saw the doll, as if looking into its glassy eyes gave them permission to finally unburden themselves. Word spread. Within weeks, James had gathered dozens of testimonies, photographs, and documents, enough to paint a picture of Ashford's buried history in colors no one could ignore. The doll's presence seemed to grow heavier with each truth uncovered, as though the weight of justice itself was pressing down. The night before he planned to go public, James dreamed again. But this time the dream was different. He stood in the center of town, holding the doll, surrounded by the faces from the photographs. They were no longer tired. They were standing tall, their gazes steady, their dignity intact. One by one they spoke, "Don't let them forget." The next morning, James walked into the Ashford courthouse with a box of evidence under one arm and the doll under the other. Local reporters were there, tipped off by Pastor Ruth and a few trusted allies. He laid everything out, the testimonies, the records, the photos, and told the stories as they had been told to him. He spoke of the men and women whose lives had been taken, of the families who had lived in fear, of the justice that had been denied for generations. The doll sat on the table beside him the whole time, its black eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights. To some, it was just a strange prop. To others, especially the elders in the crowd, it was something far more. Not everyone in that room wanted to hear the truth. Some shouted. Some walked out. But enough stayed to listen. Enough stayed to feel the shift in the air, the way the weight of silence was breaking up. By evening, the story was everywhere. in the local paper, on social media, in whispers across town. Officials promised investigations. Memorials were discussed. Names long buried in silence were spoken aloud in the open air. That night, James returned home to find the doll sitting on his porch as it always did. This time its grin seemed smaller, almost gentle. He picked it up and set it on the kitchen counter. For the first time since it arrived, the house felt light. In the weeks that followed, James kept the doll. Not because he feared it, but because he understood it now. It was more than a haunting, it was a witness. A reminder that justice is not given freely, that dignity must sometimes be fought for with both hands, and that the dead are never truly silent when the living are willing to listen. Some nights he still heard the whispers. But now they were softer. Grateful. And every so often, he swore he could hear his grandmother's voice in the mix, proud and steady. "You stood, child. You didn't run." And James knew then, the doll had chosen well.